Hello, I am Catherine Cullen, and this is Power and Politics. More details out today about Canada's plans to distribute the coronavirus vaccine. The government says it's ready. The big question remains, when will immunizations begin?
Canadians can be very confident that when a vaccine is ready, Canada will be ready.
An initial supply of vaccine is expected to become available in early 2021.
My focus is really to do my part as part of the public health agency with our team to deliver vaccines to Canadians as rapidly as possible.
An independent committee is recommending residents of long-term care homes and the people who work in them should be the first ones vaccinated. Thousands of people have died from COVID in these facilities. People over 80 are also a priority, along with healthcare workers. How long will it take to vaccinate these groups? Other essential workers will be eligible in the second stage of vaccinations, but who fits in that category could vary from province to province. So when will most Canadians start to see an impact on case numbers? We're going to tackle it all with our primetime panel. Zane Velji is a partner at North Weather. Laura Stone is a reporter with the Globe and Mail. And joining us for this part of the conversation, Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa. Hello, everybody. Delighted to have you here. Professor Deonandan, I am going to start with you because we have learned a lot more information, I think we can say, from federal officials about plans, particularly in the last week, the last few days. I guess I wonder what you think of what we've learned to this point. Are there particular issues that are outstanding in your mind?
Well, we still have safety issues to parse through. We still don't know how long immunity lasts. We still don't know what happens if you only get one dose, for example, of the major formulations. And we don't know how many doses we're going to get or when we can expect more doses. That's going to affect how you distribute the first batch. So there are a lot of unknowns still. But to the extent that we know anything, I think we're making the appropriate plans. And so I'm filled with hope, just bursting with hope.
I'm very happy to hear you. It's always wonderful when anyone says that, because I was actually, as you were speaking and you were talking about immunity and all the unknowns, what I was actually going to ask you is are we setting our hopes a little bit too high? Like, I do wonder, for instance, questions around preventing disease versus preventing transmission, right? Dr. Tam was talking today about how we really don't know that. Obviously, there's some hope if people aren't getting very sick that they're not going to be transmitting the disease. But do you think Canadians, maybe we've lost a little bit of perspective about just how promising a mass vaccination campaign is?
That's a tough question. I think many people have lost sight of the fact that we're still in the midst of a blazing pandemic, right? And other people have probably are a bit too pessimistic about the prospects of a vaccine. So we're somewhere in the middle. But you're absolutely right. The sterilizing immunity question still lingers with me as well. That's the question of, does it prevent infection or does it just prevent symptoms? It probably prevents infection, frankly, given the size of the epidemiological signal. I won't know for sure until several months go by and more data comes in. But at the very least, we're looking at a profound diminishing of lethality in the coming months.
I'm going to ask you questions just because your comments are prompted it, but I don't know if you can answer it, which is, I mean, again, one of the outstanding questions is we just don't know how long whatever effects these various vaccines have are going to last for. Is there anything in the scientific body of knowledge about vaccinations that might give us a sense of where our hope should lie on that particular issue?
Well, it looks like people recovering from COVID, most of them have lingering immunity for at least 3 or 4 months. And what we know from MERS and SARS is people have antibodies lasting for many months, if not years. Now, just because you have antibodies doesn't mean you're immune. It is unclear. That's the best I can offer. But it seems reasonable that with a large enough dose, and certainly with a booster and maybe additional boosters, we can maintain immunity for a year, probably, in which case we deploy more boosters after that. The point is we have a tool that allows us to have society open.
I want to ask you, before we move on to Zane and Laura, Professor Deonandan, about the numbers. 6 million doses in the first quarter, right? So roughly 3 million Canadians we hope that are going to get vaccinated. What do you think of that number?
It depends on 6 million of what, which formulation. That's going to affect how we distribute it. And also when we expect more, because are you going to give all of that to the first dose or reserve it so that that's 3 million people rather than 6 million people because they require 2 doses each? It's something. It's a lot more than I thought we'd get in the first quarter, to be honest, but it's not enough. So it's a start. And depending on how we deploy that allotment, that will have the profound effect on our ability to slow spread. So it can't just be first come, first serve. The deployment has to be strategic.
Laura, I want to bring you in here for your perspective on the sort of Fed-Prov push-pull here. I mean, we had Premier Ford calling up vaccine makers this week. And we know that we're heading into this meeting next week that is, yes, certainly about federal health transfers if you take the Premier's take on it, but it's going to be about vaccinations as well. Can you just sort of give us the big picture of how it's going, this back and forth between the federal government and the provinces on the vaccination issue?
Well, there does seem to be a bit of a scrambling quality to it all, Catherine. I mean, here in Ontario, the province only announced its vaccination task force today after kind of previewing it for a couple of weeks with the appointment of Rick Hillier as the chair of that task force. I spoke to a doctor, Dr. Bogosh, who's a frequent commentator in the media.
See, we've heard of him, I think.
Who was appointed to that task force, and he got a call last night telling him that he was on it. So there certainly seems to be, we call it hurry up and wait. We've all been waiting for this vaccine for so long, and now everything has kicked into high gear. I certainly appreciate from the province's perspective, as we just heard, there are a lot of unknowns, and it does make a difference when vaccines will arrive, what kind, how many doses each province will get. But there's certainly a lot of work to do. And when we talk about long-term care homes, for instance, I was speaking with General Hillier about his new role, and even he has unanswered questions about how that would go out. For instance, if Ontario receives the Pfizer vaccine and it can't be transported for some reason, will it make it to long-term care homes first, or will they have to deploy it elsewhere, depending on the timeline of that vaccine, if it's set to spoil? I mean, there's all sorts of factors at play. I think you're seeing right now sort of the cracks in the Federation, more so than you've seen throughout this pandemic, with a bit of the blame game going on, and certainly from Premier Ford pointing fingers at the federal government and saying, I've asked some key questions and I still haven't gotten answers to them. So there's certainly hard at work, but there's definitely a scrambling quality to it all on both sides, of everyone kind of just trying to get it together as we kick this into high gear.
Zane, let's take what Laura's saying and let's add to that what I think is implicit in what she's saying, which is like that key question of when. We know there's a lot of pressure on politicians to give a vaccination date, and an interesting manifestation of this has been Premier Kenney coming out and saying he did put an exact date on the table, but that led to a little bit of political back and forth. I believe we have a little clip montage of this discussion around January 4th. So let's play that, and then I want you to respond, Zane.
We've been assured by the federal government that shipments will begin to arrive by January 4 and continue to arrive in waves throughout the early part of next year.
From a procurement standpoint, however, we are not working with a January 4th date in particular.
Well, we said early January. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Premier, but I think it's a reasonable assumption.
So, Zane, you know a lot about political communications. What do you think about what we just saw play out there?
What? There's politics being played with a date, really? Yeah, that's what I think's happening here, right? Like, if you're Premier Kenney here in Alberta, who, by the way, has been getting slogged quite aggressively for first his absence, then his lack of restrictions, and now the conversation on field hospitals here in Alberta, which we can talk about. But for him, he's never had what you'd call positive, constructive relationship with Justin Trudeau. In fact, he's used Justin Trudeau as a foil. So to throw out a date there and then have the government really not meet it, the federal government not meet it, is politically advantageous. It allows you to point the finger, perhaps distract from the attention you are getting for your lack of management on this file. So there's a bit of politics being played here. Regardless, though, let's talk about the elemental nature of this vaccine rollout. Outside of the hiccups that the federal government has had last week, they've done a good job on procurement, or so we think, but rollout and adoption are two entirely different things, right? Rollout, we've talked about saying we've got the infrastructure, we know how to roll out influenza like we have, but the thing is, as we've just been discussing on this panel, the dosage, the storage, those things are complicated factors. And then the biggest sort of hurdle I think that we're only mildly addressing, because it seems so abstract right now, is adoption. And this is where the federal government has to be incredibly careful. Last week I talked about this concept of, this communalism around the vaccine may work when it kind of says that, Canada will have every single person in this country vaccinated before every person in the US does. That may work, but very shortly, this is going to turn into a me conversation. When I'm getting my dose, when am I getting my golden ticket, so to speak? So as soon as that happens, the government is going to need to know how to communicate that. This is more than logistics now. This is about what they say and how they keep people together in this thing. And then the inverse of that problem is the fact that there's going to be many people that reject this vaccine. 6 out of 10 Canadians did not take the H1N1 vaccine. So when you have this going on, it is this really tough problem of saying, this is not just about you, this is about us. And then when it gets to the question of people who don't want to take it, it's not just about you, it's about us, in the inverse. So it's a really tough communications problem, compounded with the federal-provincial relationship and compounded with the divorced elemental relationship of this rollout. I'm not envious of folks that have to execute this, but these are some of the considerations that I'm looking at as someone here in Alberta. And the final point I'll very quickly add, especially compounding this on the last point, is someone like Jason Kenney, who says, while I'm going to be taking this vaccine, I'm not going to make it mandatory for anyone here in Alberta. More politics being played with the vaccine.
Well, I mean, with mandatory vaccinations would be a whole other kettle of fish, and we're not going to go there today.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Raywat Deonandan, I do want to, we're plumb out of time, but I really just want to ask you quickly about a difficult subject, to be honest, which is that you have talked publicly about some of the abuse that you and your colleagues have had to put up with as you have spoken publicly about this. And I just wonder, as I say, we don't have much time, but is there a message you would like to get across to Canadians about, I just shake my head, like we're asking you guys for help to explain things, and people are hurling insults at you. I don't know, but what would you like to say about it?
Well, we never had to anticipate that in addition to thinking about surveillance systems, vaccine platforms, we'd have to think about convincing people that a real thing is a real thing. And that the problem of that is being weaponized by misinformation and disinformation coming from various political corners. So it's an uphill battle right now, and unfortunately it's overlapping with other kinds of misanthropic behaviors like racism and sexism and so forth. So we have a ways to go, and I think the solution going forward is better science education, frankly.
Okay, so a good note to end things on. Thank you all so much, particularly Raywat Deonandan, epidemiologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa, who joined us for this portion of the program. Zane and Laura will be back throughout the hour, but first, we're going to hear from Major General Denis Fortin